Yeah. Welcome to Table Tennis Timed Out. This is the first of our new series in which we will look at the game beyond the table. Today's episode is Rule Changes, as we are joined by our regular participant in Colin Wilson. Colin is a 2 times Commonwealth medalist and a TV broadcaster. And we're also joined by international umpire, making his debut on the podcast or the Zoomcast, Roger Thomas. We will start with Roger. Roger, can you tell us a little bit about yourself as you're making your debut, about your coaching in Haddington and your route to becoming an international umpire?
Yeah, okay. I play in Edinburgh, and I live just outside Edinburgh. I came to Edinburgh University in, shall we just say, the mid-1960s. And I started playing table tennis then for Edinburgh University. When I graduated, I started playing for Murrayfield in Edinburgh, and I played for them for 47 years before joining Haddington when it started up. And I've been playing there since about 2012, I think. I started as an umpire when I was at university because I just found it really quite interesting. And I thought that if I'm going to play, I really ought to know the rules. So the best way was to become an umpire. I qualified as an international umpire, again, last century. And I've umpired at Commonwealth Games, Olympics, and all the Scottish national and local tournaments. I also do some refereeing at local tournaments as well. Okay.
Good. And just before we move on to the subject, you're also coaching in Haddington and East Lothian. How's that all going?
Well, that's the club in Haddington is thriving. When I joined, there were 6, shall we say, even more elderly than me players on a couple of old tables. We now got about 100 members, 7 teams in the local league, and we've started 2 what I call satellite clubs in Gullen and Dunbar, who also now put teams in the league. So it's going really, really well.
Great. Okay, great introduction there. Colin, you're back with us again for the 4th or the 5th time. As I said, you've come off medalist, TV broadcaster. What have you been doing since we was last on the Zoom? And what are you doing now?
Well, since last I was on the Zoom, I've moved house 3 times. Moved around Corby where my boys are. I've got myself remarried and moved out to North Nottinghamshire. So I live in Sir Brian Way. So you'll be very pleased as a Nottingham Forest supporter to hear that. No doubt, named after Sir Brian Clough. I go to the local table tennis club now that Howard Knott coaches at, Sam Walker's coach. And I still help to look after Smash down in Kettering, and I'm still working as a executive coach, management consultant, leadership developer.
Yeah. And how can people get hold of you, Colin? Just by email or?
Yeah, find me on Facebook, Colin Wilson 374, or on LinkedIn, Colin Wilson 62. If anyone wants to email me, you can do at info@businessathlete.co.uk. That's info@businessathlete.co.uk.
Brilliant. Right, let's get on with the show. And the first rule change we're going to look at is long before I was playing, the table tennis net was 6.5 inches high. Games were going on till 2 o'clock in the morning as people were terrified of hitting. And in order to speed the game up, they dropped the net from 6.5 inches to 6 inches, which is 15.2 centimeters, I believe. And was that a good move? I'll start with Colin, or a bad move, or somewhere in between.
Okay, well, in a way, you started with a difficult time in the 100 years that we've had since table tennis really got going. So Table Tennis England just had its 100th anniversary, 2021, I think, so it's 1921. The International Table Tennis Federation had its beginnings 1926. Based in London, obviously, then spread quickly throughout the world. But you were getting spectator groups of 10,000 plus at Wembley Arena back in the 30s, and there were some fantastic times after the vellum period, with the sandpaper bat era, with the short pimple, no sponge era. Some wonderful play, some wonderful rallies. Lengths of rallies were great. And then it gradually moved, with the net being as high as it was, to a dominance of the defensive player. Then the rallies were getting too long. It was less dynamic to play, less dynamic certainly to watch. And that's where you mentioned that they decided to reduce the height of the net, which I think was an inevitability. And given the change of ability and training methods, and the bats that they were using with short rubber pimples, couldn't get much spin, but you could get about 8% of what you can get now. So you're starting to get a little bit of spin. And as a result of that, it was the right thing to do to reduce the height of the net. Although I'll come back to it later, because maybe we should go the other way now.
Yeah. Roger, as the referee, you've got the best view in the house, as Stuart McGowan once said. So was it a good move?
Well, just as you started by saying, it was even before I started playing that this happened. I know that the attackers struggled with the higher net, not least because there wasn't very much spin those days. So you couldn't play a heavy topspin to bring the ball back down over the net. So that was really a factor which, I mean, these days, if the net went back up, I don't think attackers would mind, in the sense that, you know, a heavy topspin can bring the ball back down onto the table over a net. So it was a factor of the style of play as well.
Yeah.
In fact, you talked earlier about the length of rallies. I think in the World Championship final in 1937, 1 point lasted over an hour. You know, and that was when they introduced the expedite rule following that.
Yeah.
So when you think that with the expedite rule, which those days it was, if any game lasts more than 15 minutes, then a receiver making 13 good returns wins the point.
Yeah.
That itself would have stopped the rallies being long, even with a higher net.
Yeah.
You know, so there's pros and cons, and there's good reasons and maybe not so good reasons, because I say expedite solved the problem that you're saying you thought the lower net would solve.
Yeah. And so again, so is it like Colin, you just touched on that, back to you, then would you raise it again? And then would it be 6.5 inches, 7 inches? Would you make the table bigger, smaller?
Yeah, okay.
Let's just stick with the net.
Big questions. In terms of what Roger's saying about the shortening the rallies, they did achieve that by expedite. Yeah. The problem with that is if the game balance is such that the defensive player has an advantage, you end up with a kind of a holding serve kind of situation where people lose on their serve, the other person loses on their serve, the other person. So yes, it was a solution to longer rallies. I'm not sure it's a complete solution, and obviously, you know, that's what we're debating. Because of the heavy topspin that reversed sandwich rubber in the modern times can do, you're effectively creating an upside down aeroplane wing, so the ball goes over the net, dive bombs down into the table, so effectively it makes the net lower. So would I do anything about that now? Well, I think we'll probably talk about the ball size, which was an attempt to lengthen the rallies again, because the rallies were getting very, very short. Like one World Championships, the average rally was 2.2 shots each, which is not great for spectators. Very, 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 very technical, very, very skilled, but not very visual to the casual observer, which is part of what we want as the marketing the sport. I would consider raising the net, although there's some nuances to it, because there are some fantastic rallies on YouTube, but most of the rallies are still pretty short. So I think on average, I think I would raise the net. And the question is how much you would do that. As Roger says, you know, attackers would be happy with that. Well, to a point. And Roger and I can debate this. Where is that point? I think it starts to probably have an impact at probably just under half an inch, I would say. But what you'd need is an experiment over maybe 12 months, because the game and the tactics and the players will, of course, they will game the system and learn how to do it. So a one-off event to try and prove something won't work. You need a process over a period of time for the tactics to evolve and stabilize.
Yeah.
You know, when we have these days ping pong tournaments as well, where it's back to the original bats, do you think that would make a difference there if we raise the net perhaps in just that competition?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, I've played in the sandpaper events. I used to have a hardback world ranking of 16. And I've commentated many years at Alexandra Palace. I think the game balance, if that's what we're talking about, for sandpaper with a 6-inch net, is just about perfect. Even then, the attackers are winning ultimately, so I wouldn't raise it, but I certainly wouldn't reduce it. I don't think I'd raise it. I think it's a pretty good sport where it is, sandpaper table tennis.
I certainly wouldn't reduce it anymore.
No.
No. Okay, sponge, the Japanese sponge in the 50s, which basically was almost as thick as a sponge cake. Roger, have you looked at the research on that, or any opinions? It was in, it was played, and then it was banned.
Yeah. It's interesting. One of the things I do like about table tennis and the rules evolution is we've very rarely banned technological advancements. When reverse pimples came in and when people started having combination bats, the thing I was really pleased about was the ITTF didn't put any restrictions or bans on it. All they said was, you've got to have different coloured sides of the bat, which I thought was a very, very smart regulation.
Yeah.
It didn't impede technology. It didn't impede styles of play. It just said it's going to be fair.
Yeah.
And I thought that was brilliant.
Okay, sponge, Colin, before sandwich.
Yeah, so the very thick sandwich bats where there are no limits. So stick a bar sponge on either side of your wood, and then away you go with your new bat. It got banned after a relatively short time historically, because I think people felt that the speed and spin was you couldn't cope with it. I think had it stayed, people would have got used to it. But it was a kind of a parallel to tennis, where the double strung racket came out. And tennis pretty quickly banned the double strung racket and made it more standard. We kind of got rid of the very thick sponge, but maintained the technology. And actually the loop shot, the kind of heavy topspin, was actually first criticized as unplayable with no sponge. Even before sponge, it was regarded as a very, should we ban this stroke, which is obviously an impossible thing to do. So there are already these discussions going on. Probably good that they didn't allow the very thickest sponge. As Roger says, we've allowed a lot of technology to be maintained, but now because of the sponge rule, sponge effect, the limit is 4 millimeters of sponge and rubber on your racket these days. So we do have a limit. Although having said that, we've probably got about the fastest controllable bats that there's ever been at the moment.
Yeah, it's interesting because from sponge we went to what it was then termed sandwich, which a modern player wouldn't know what that term means. And basically that meant sponge with rubber on top, either pimples in or pimples out. And it's often said, it makes you smile, these pimples out rubbers. Well, it was actually the pimples out rubbers were first, and it was the reverse came second. And as Roger was saying, there was a lot of technical changes with that. We all used to play all red or green or blue or black, whatever. And then that all changed basically as we remember in 1980, probably, when John Hilton won the European Championships using black on both sides, anti-spin on one side, tackiness on the other, won the European Championships. Obviously, it was in icy conditions in Bern, and there was a draft, and we could talk about that championships. But basically, it was just after that, they changed the rules to two different colours. And then people were having dark red and purple and red and black and dark blue. And then they changed again to simply have red and black. And that is where we are now.
Well, almost.
Right. Any comments to add to that before we move on?
Yeah, because it changed again recently. You're now allowed, one side must be black and the other must be, I think the regulation says, clearly distinguishable from black.
Yeah. And so who decides that? You as the referee?
Yes.
Do you have to do a colourblind test before you become a referee?
I don't think so. I've never had a colourblind test anyway. But yes, I do. Now, I do think it is actually the referee and not the umpire that decides that.
Yeah. Brilliant.
A key distinction.
Yeah, the big distinction. Yeah, rather than a point of fact or a point of law is when the referee gets involved, isn't it? Yeah. I mean, the umpire is we're going to have an whole session. The umpire is allowed to make a mistake if he thinks it hits the edge or he doesn't. That doesn't matter. Where if he gets an actual rule wrong, that's when you would bring in the referee to adjudicate.
Yes. And this is why the referee is not allowed to umpire.
Yeah.
Because he can't be the appeal against himself.
Yes. He can't be judge on his own.
That's right. Yeah.
Facts.
Yeah.
Okay. Again, another major change. I'm not quite sure when it happened. I'm guessing about 1998, 2000. I ought to have looked it up before this Zoomcast. Was we changed from 21 to 11, but we went from 5 services to 2 services. And I actually did the percentages of 5 over 21 and 2 over 11. And it was nearer to have done an exact swap. It would have been, the closest number was 3 services. To have halved 21, because obviously if it was 10-10, it would be 2.5 services, but it's 21 to 11, so it's nearer 3 than 2. So we 21 to 11 in 2 services. First of all, 21 to 11, and then we'll discuss the service afterwards. We'll start with you, Roger. 21 to 11, good idea?
Mixed. Surprisingly. The purpose, as I understand it, was, just as you were saying earlier, the interest in the spectators is that if you're playing, for example, as we do in the league, five games for a match, playing to 11, there are more deciding points at the end of a game. You know, so you can win 3-2 rather than just 2-1. You know, so it's meant to be for spectators either directly or on television to get more interest in the closeness of the competition. I think that's quite good. The downside, as a player, I find that when my opponent, as they always do, get a lucky net or an edge playing to 11, you've got less points available to recover. So, you know, an edge almost counts twice.
So what happens when you get an edge or an edge?
I don't.
Well, Colin.
Roger, you sound like a Nottingham Forest supporter saying that.
That's right, yeah. 21 to 11. Yeah. Right, Colin, 21 to 11. Well,
short answer, yes, very good move. I think, again, from a spectator's point of view, just waiting a long time for an inevitability isn't that interesting relative to having more crunch points. So someone's winning 11-3 and you can see that one person's better than the other, but it's going to go all the way to 21, then everyone kind of switches off. It's just a bit of a non-event. Whereas with 11, there's always the chance that there's always a much greater chance that someone can get to 11. I interviewed Fan Zhendong at the Copper Box at the World Team Cup 2018. Chinese superstar, one of my absolute favorites of all time. And I said, well, you beat so-and-so, South Korean player, but it wasn't 4-0, it was 4-1. You know, was that a problem to you? And what's the expectation from your Chinese team and coaches about, you know, winning 4-1, not 4-0? And he smiled and he said, yeah, he says, in the old days, there was pressure to win and, you know, win handsomely. He said, but these days, he said, it's okay if I lose one game. If I win 4-1 in a best of 7, he says, for me, that's perfectly acceptable. And for everyone else, it's perfectly acceptable as well. He says, the other players are really, really good and you're only playing up to 11. So, you know, they accept that they are going to drop games. They'd hope that they wouldn't drop 4 of them in a best of 7 all at the same time.
Right. Okay, then on the same 21 to 11, it's to say logically there should be 3 services each. And I'm just going to put a spanner in the works. I had a chat with Peter Shaw after we did the rehearsal for this Zoomcast, and I was saying to Peter, what do you think to 11 and service? And you know, you can't plan your services and you can't strategize. And he says, well, do you want to? You know, having two services each, he made the point that it actually stops it being a service dominated game. And isn't that what you want? I'm not saying he meant that, but he put that in as an argument, where my logic has always been, I like the strategy of service. I like the, as Roger mentioned, it's almost like a bowler having 6 bowls, and he can put in a flipper, he can put in a googly, and he can put a couple of straight ones. Yeah. So services, Roger, back to you. 2 services, 3 services, service all the time until the game's over, like tennis.
Well, I think you actually summarised it pretty well there. As a server, I quite like the ability to build up to a serve I know I'm going to play at some point, but I want to lure them into thinking, no, it's the same one all the time, and it isn't. I like that as a server. I mean, as a receiver, yeah, it's just that's a challenge. You've got to equally outthink the server, which is what I liked about 5.
Yeah.
I mean, you can still do it a bit with 2, in that you can make the second one look the same as the first one, but it isn't up to a point, you know. So there's less of that, and at least with 2, you know, the service changes to the other chap. He can have a go now, you know. So I don't worry about it over much.
Okay, Colin. 2 services, 3 service,
Okay.
the whole game.
Yeah. So we've gone down from 5 serves up to 21, down to 2 serves up to 11. Let's look at the extremes with 11. You could have one person serving all the time in an up to 11, a little bit like a tennis game. 15 love, 30 love, 40 love game. It's 4 you've got to win, whereas table tennis, it would be 11. I think in table tennis, typically at most levels, service is an advantage. And so over 11, or 11 for the winner, you know, 20, it's a 20-point game if it goes to 10 all, for instance, plus. I think that if it's a significant advantage to the server, then you're just going to end up with the server winning every game. Then it's 1 game all, then it's 2-1, then it's 2 all, and you'd have to end up with some kind of tie break at some point in the future. Again, too much inevitability about it. In some games, service is a disadvantage, just between any 2 players, clash of styles or levels or what have you, and the same problem applies. So do we need to limit it? Yes. Do we need to limit it less than 5? Well, the other end of the scale, you'd have 1 each. 1 serve each. 1 serve each, 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 1 then you can't do what Roger's talking about, which is build a momentum up to a serve or a range of disguised serves that you want to do. And I would agree with that. Again, not just game balance, but for the spectator, you've got you want to build a bit of a narrative. You've got a story to the game. And if you have one serve each, I think you don't get that sense of familiarity from the casual observer as to what's actually going on. There's more going on than they can see. And that's always been a key problem for table tennis and its relationship with spectators. So I wouldn't go to 1 either. We have 2 at the moment. Would I go to 5? No, because it might just push too much advantage one way. So I kind of like your idea of 3 at a time.
Okay, good. I'm sure we'll be debating this in the future. Okay, another
I'll tell you one difficulty with 3. From an umpire's point of view, when there's 2, you know who's meant to be serving from the score.
Yes,
that's true. Yes.
With 3, I go, hang on, who's meant to be, because it does happen, the wrong person serves sometimes.
No, a 2-1 who service it.
And at least, with 2, I
get you soon get used to it, because with 2 it's multiples of 2. It's an even number where you've only got to say in your mind, let me divide this by 3. It's 3. I don't know. It's 6-3, and therefore it's bound to be 7-2. It can't be a change of serve. Anyway, let's move on. And
I'm all for making the umpire's job easier.
And I'm not all for making it harder. And I'm grateful to thousands of Rogers over the years that have umpired my games. So I do understand that the demand on the umpire is something that you don't want to take for granted.
Interesting. We're going to have a session on umpiring as again scoring. You go to a tournament and the reluctant player who has lost, he doesn't umpire, he scores the game while looking at his mobile phone these days. And so that's it. So we moved then again to try to increase rally. We went from 38 to 40 mil in the table tennis ball. And right, Colin, do you want to start with that one?
Okay. Right. So yes, there was a rule change. A ball was 38 millimeters diameter. They decided to make it 40 millimeters diameter. They thought about it for, I don't know, a couple of years seriously, and then implemented this change. Let's go back to the reason for the change. The reason for the change was to lengthen the rallies, because the rallies were said to be coming too short, which I agreed with. My view, my argument, my evidence was that if you wanted to lengthen the rallies, changing the ball from 38 mil diameter to add 1 mil on each side to make it 40 mil diameter would make a negligible difference, and would also reduce the amount of spin and make it more of a grunt power game rather than a subtle spin tactical game. Maybe because I'm not that big physically and I was quite good with my kind of touch skills, 38 mil just suited me better. So maybe I would say that, wouldn't I? But I did believe it, and I think it's proved to be the case. I said it'd have no impact on the length of the rallies, and I don't see any evidence that's been put forward that the rallies have got longer as a result. And I've seen plenty of short rally games with 40 mil. What they should have done is raise the net.
Roger, 38 to 40.
It's quite interesting that in the discussions about the height of the net, the ball and everything, sometimes it's to shorten the rallies, sometimes it's to lengthen the rallies. What's the ideal length of a rally?
There you go.
The other thing,
more than 2.2 on average. That's what I'd say.
Yeah.
But not an hour.
No. You actually want to see a rally develop, don't you?
Yes, exactly that. It's a narrative that we want to see.
You want to see the advantage move from one to the other as a rally develops.
Or build and build.
It's
exactly that.
That's the key to watching, whether you watch it on YouTube or live or whatever. The ones that are interesting is the development of the rally.
And I think that's what tennis does so well, within a point and across points.
Yes. I mean, so that's the key.
Yeah.
Another thing I noticed in the change in the ball was that with the smaller ball spinning more rapidly, you could sometimes get a stroboscopic effect with fluorescent lights where the ball disappears.
Yeah.
If that ball spins at 50 hertz, where'd it go? Briefly, so that, that's just, of course, the answer to that is get rid of don't use fluorescent lights, which is absolutely the case in tournaments.
Yeah. Okay, just before we move on to the final subject, is we've looked at all these rule changes, and it is often said, oh, well, this rule favoured this player and this rule favours that. I remember, if you take Scotland, for example, when the game was up to 21 and 5 services, Ewan Walker was the national champion about 4 times in a row.
Yeah.
So they changed the ball from, I'm not too sure which came first. I think the ball change came first. So they changed the ball from 38 to 40, and Ewan Walker still won the national championships. So they then changed it to 11 points, and people would say, no, actually they made another change. They changed the service from behind the back to where you must see the bat and the ball to whatever it is now. And then Ewan Walker still won the next national championships. And then they changed it to 11, and a lot of people says, well, this is really going to, catch Ewan out now because he's not going to dominate from his serves. And he still won every national championship. So no matter what rule change they made, it didn't have the desired effect. Well, not the desired effect. And the other example is one we used when we did the rehearsal. It was often said by the players who were sort of 10 or 15 years older than me that the modern player wouldn't live in the hard bat age. So back in the 10, 15, 20 years ago, Colin Wilson and Graham Sandley entered the hard bat championships, in which it was the British Championships. Colin will correct me if I've got that title wrong. And therefore, Colin and Graham had to compete with a hard bat against the Henry Buists of the world and the Peter Pickfords and even Dennis Neal, obviously, was a hard bat player. And therefore, Colin and Graham, as expected, were to go out in the first round because they couldn't cope with this dramatic change, going back to proper table tennis. And guess what? The final was between Colin Wilson and Graham Sandley, and Colin won it and became the British hard bat champion. Go on, just give us a couple of minutes on that, Colin, and then we'll move on.
Okay. So modern players are often accused of not having the skill of the classical game with the hard bats and no sponge. And we said, yeah, fine. We just didn't really believe it, but people wanted to believe that. It's very nostalgic. But we were getting a bit of stick for just being modern players that could just use our wrist to flick the spin onto the ball, and it's very different these days. So we said, hang on a minute, we've played for England. We're allowed to go in the International Club Hard Bat Championships. So that's anyone that had played hard bat for their country internationally was allowed to play in it. I don't know if it was English, British, world, but it was all international players from the era. Clearly, Graham and I were a little bit younger, but Stuart Gibbs was still playing fantastic sandwich bat table tennis. He was in it. Jeff Ingber was in it. Some of the people that you mentioned. And I thought I had a bit of an easy draw and I did fine. Then in between matches, I'd watch Graham Sandley, and he beat Stuart Gibbs, who was highly ranked with a sponge bat still, never mind an international with a hard bat. He beat him like 21-14, 21-6. He pinned him up against the wall and just pancaked him all over the place. And it was great to watch. And in the final, Graham and I played, and I decided that to beat Graham, what I needed to do was stay very close to the table, get as much topspin as I could. And I basically did kind of mini loops off the bounce, very early, heavy topspin, given you couldn't get much spin, but it was enough to make the ball kick and dip. And yeah, sure enough, I won it. Later, I got a world ranking of 16. and later again, I was often in the sandpaper bat events, and I was commentating at the Alexandra Palace year after year on the sandpaper World Championships in my when I was a bit too old to keep up with the top players. But absolutely loved it. Ewan Walker, he won up to 21. He won with the 40mm ball. He won because he's good at table tennis.
Brilliant.
There are some basic principles behind this.
Yeah. Right. Okay.
Like Overwhelmed, you see, he won in his time. No matter what you did with him, Wellner just wins.
Yeah.
It's like good.
Right. We've got 5 minutes to stick to our schedule. And it is one where I have strong opinions. On all the others, I'm quite flexible, really. I don't mind. And that is this timeout. Again, timeout came when the game was still played up to 21 points, where each player could have one timeout. And he'd come across and talk to his coach, and then they could go back on, and it became tactical, and it became, if somebody lost 6 points in a row, they'd call a timeout, or if it was 19-17. Anyway, I never particularly liked it. I felt the coach was having, as a coach, I felt the coach was having far too much of an influence at junior table tennis, and there is a part of me that feels they should have no coaches when they're actually competing. In the training hall, yes, but in the main event. But anyway, going off key a bit here. But then they changed to 11 points, but they still kept the time out. Now, again, having a chat with Peter Shaw on this as well, and Peter says, well, you can shout now between rallies. And you can say serve to the backhand, serve to the forehand. The reason is it's like prohibition. They couldn't control it, so they made it legal. So with you've been able to coach in between points, which I totally disagree with, there's also a timeout. I would just get rid of it. Roger.
I agree with you, certainly, about the between points. I think you go into a game and you're on your own. It's up to you against the opponent. You do your best. At the end of a game, if a coach wants to say to you, did you realize that he was doing it, or have you I'm okay with that between games.
Yeah.
The thing about timeouts I find is that they're quite often used tactically. 9-10 down, timeout. The purpose is to disrupt the other player's momentum.
Yeah.
And I'm less keen on that. If the player isn't good enough to manage himself through the game, or between games get a hint from someone else who maybe seen something you haven't noticed, then that should be sufficient.
Yeah. Okay. Colin?
Well, I've played, I've coached, I've corner coached, captained, if you like, and I've called a timeout in my time, and I've sat with players over long tournaments, being in their corner. I once took an England team abroad to Hungary, Austria, and France. And at one point, Matthew Syed was playing, and he played Ma Wenger, world number 9 from China. And I was, at the time, you weren't really allowed to coach in between points, but you could encourage. And I thought, well, where's the line there? I just thought, I'll go with it, and I'll let the umpire decide whether or not. And of course, you're talking in a different language. So all of the coaches were coaching during the game. In this event, Matthew, having a very, very large brain, very, very large hard drive, he was able to play at that level under pressure, and I was able to communicate with him during the game. And he was able, you could see in his eyes, he was turning his ear and he was listening, and he could see in his eyes, he was taking it in. He would then decide for himself what to make of what I said. I've got no doubt at all that I would say this, wouldn't I? It was a team performance, and he won. He beat the world number 9, his best win ever, I think. And I'm proud that I was in his corner, that I was inputting, that those things were making a difference. I remember exactly what I said.
Yeah.
Get it, play to his forehand, get him to loop to your forehand, which is not your strength, float it down the line. That's the key. And it worked. And Matthew was one of the few players in the world that was able to take on and implement that information under pressure. Fantastic, really fantastic. Gives me goosebumps to remember it now. And so I've done this professionally. I've been paid to coach and what have you. Having said that, I think I'd go back with Dave and I'd say just get rid of the coaches. You've got 2 players. Get on and play the match. However, how do you stop information getting into the court? Someone shouting from where? So there's always going to be a grey area. As a result of that, do you allow the coach to be there?
But strictly timeout, Colin. Strictly timeout rather than.
Well, if we just go back to timeout itself, yeah, I might allow a timeout, but I'd want the player to call it and for the player to stay on their own and not get advice.
Yeah.
I do think in junior tournaments, it can be very, very useful to help the junior to develop, but not for a coach to do it for reasons of putting the other person off. I think that's just bad news. But in general, I wouldn't have it, except for a player calling it and giving themselves a little bit of a break. I think that's quite okay. Too much from the sidelines is not great, but I do notice the change when coaches do call timeouts, because typically it's a coach that will call the timeout, not the player. I always say to a player, I'm not going to call a timeout. If you want a timeout, you call it, but I'm not going to, you should be self-aware enough to know when to call a timeout. I'm not going to do that, because there are times that the coach calls a timeout and makes it worse.
Yeah.
How do they know exactly what's in the player's mind, what's going to happen afterwards, what's state?
The player, in my view, should be both physically and mentally and skillfully appropriate to play the game they're playing.
Self-sufficient.
Yes.
They need to be self-sufficient.
Self-sufficient in all aspects, not just skill, but stamina, attitude, understanding of what's going on. And by all means, a coach outside a game can help develop that by reviewing what happened, but not during a game.
Yeah. Okay, right. Time has beaten us. We've covered 7 major rule changes. There's been lots of tinkering as well. Hopefully this will arouse a lot of discussion on the Scottish Veterans or Past Masters page and other Facebook pages. So a big thanks to Roger and a big thanks to Colin, and we'll see you again soon.